Okay, well, Edinburgh is one of the most appropriate settings for a paper on Margaret Thatcher and her use of the Bible. Not only was or is she as disliked in Scotland as she is across much of the north of England, she even gave her own talk on the Bible very close to our present location. As many of you may well know or even remember, one of Thatcher's most famous or infamous speeches was given to the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland in 1988, the so-called Sermon on the Mound, which in many ways functioned as a response to criticism, particularly of the variety found in the Archbishop of Canterbury's Commission on Urban Priority Areas, i.e. Faith in the City, published in 1985. Now, I've been working on Thatcher and various uses of the Bible in English politics over the past few years, which is culminating in the book Matthew mentioned, which is due to be published this year, under the same title as this lecture, Harnessing Chaos. What I tried to do in this book is provide an explanation of changes in dominant politicized assumptions about what the Bible really means in English politics and culture since the 1960s. I look at how the social upheavals of the 1960s and the economic shift from the post-war dominance of Keynesianism to the post-70s dominance of neoliberalism brought about certain emphases and nuances in the ways in which the Bible is popularly understood, particularly in relation to dominant political ideas. I examine the decline of the politically radical biblical interpretation in parliamentary politics and the victory of a modified form of Margaret Thatcher's rereading of what we might call a liberal Bible tradition, following the normalisation of a modified form of Thatcherism more generally. The book covers a range of other figures and topics to illustrate these changes, including the Marxist historian Christopher Hill, the English nationalist, or British nationalist Enoch Powell, various musicians, Life of Brian, Jeffrey Archer, Tony Blair, the Coalition, and political readings of the Bible from across the political spectrum, including the fate of radical readings of the Bible in English political discourse. It's important, I think, to show that what I'm about to say is as much a part of a broad and often contradictory cultural trend as much as it was down to individuals such as Thatcher. But Thatcher played a central role in shifting assumptions about what the Bible really means in English political discourse. And what I want to look at today in particular are the ways in which Thatcher seized upon these historic and cultural changes in the UK and formulated her influential reading of the Bible in English politics. But before we look at Thatcher, I want to look at some dominant trends in politicised understandings of the Bible over the past 100 years to get some idea of what Thatcher was doing in the 1970s onwards with her understanding of the Bible. Now, the first example of what the Bible really means is what Yvonne Sherwood calls the liberal Bible. Looking partly, surprisingly perhaps, but I don't think so, looking partly at George Bush's use of the Bible, Sherwood described the liberal Bible as an interpretive tradition developing since the 16th and 17th centuries. The liberal Bible is an understanding of the Bible as supportive of freedom of conscience, rights, law, government, democracy, consensus, and marks a shift away from the absolute monarchist Bible, where decisions made by the monarch were to be seen as proof of divine power. The liberal Bible has also produced the mistaken assumption that the Bible is the foundation and consonant with the principles of Western democracies, without acknowledging that such a view of the Bible has its roots in 16th and 17th century Europe. The liberal Bible is able to endorse actions against its constructed opposite, the undemocratic, tyrannical, and terror. Because of its early modern origins, the liberal Bible regularly manifests itself in vague political sentiments. So it's very common to hear politicians talking about the Bible is about freedom. All of it. Now, there's not time to go into any detail here, but I should stress that these sorts of readings of the Bible are extremely common in political discourse, certainly in the UK, Europe, and America. A related assumption that runs throughout all political persuasions is a hermeneutical tradition we might call the cultural Bible, following Jonathan Sheehan's analysis of the influence of what he called the Enlightenment Bible. Sheehan has shown in detail how the Enlightenment produced a Bible which was, in sometimes contradictory ways, a philological and pedagogical resource, a literary classic, a moral guidebook, and a historical archive. These different strands were encapsulated by the cultural Bible as biblical readers and interpreters interacted with developing ideas of secularization. That these developments were taking place at a time of developing nationalism and Orientalism, particularly in the 19th century, is of some significance. This Bible was always part of our Western culture and civilization, and you often see it referred to as, the Bible referred to as an English classic. It's particularly convenient Bible because you don't have to be a believer to accept the importance of the cultural Bible. Among the many countless examples, we might highlight Richard Dawkins, of all people, as an advocate of learning about the Bible, especially the King James Version, because he says it belongs to our heritage and our culture. Now, while the Liberal Bible and the Cultural Bible cut across parliamentary party politics, the Radical Bible is largely part of the Labour tradition. The Radical Bible is an understanding of the Bible which, put crudely, equates the Bible with socialism in one form or other, or even revolutionary transformation. A number of themes in the Radical Bible tradition include land and wealth redistribution, confronting power, confronting wealth, communitarianism, egalitarianism, anti-clericalism, direct access to God, importance of the conscience and/or spirit, prophetic critique, and even apocalyptic language, particularly with reference to a radical transformation of the social, economic, and political order. To invert the famous saying of Morgan Phillips, the Radical Bible owes as much to Marx as it does to Methodism. The Radical Bible in English politics and culture likewise has a long history and is very well attested, but it's not until the turn of the 20th century and the emergence of the Labour movement, with its strong nonconformist contingent, that a more sustained influence of the Radical Bible was felt in party politics. Now, these are the most dominant traditions of what the Bible really means in contemporary English political discourse. But these understandings of the Bible were to undergo significant shifts in light of social upheavals of the 1960s, which involved potentially contradictory strands of anarchism, libertarianism, anti-establishmentarianism, free love, and any number of reactions against those. These upheavals, culminating in 1968, contributed to the decline of the post-war consensus and an intensification of ideas relating to individualism and consumerism. This individualism was, of course, having broader social impact. Recessions, stagflation, IMF-imposed austerity, and the strikes of the 1970s would mark the end of Keynesianism and the rise of the individualist and ostensibly anti-statist neoliberalism. The rhetoric of freedom and anti-establishmentarianism was, at times, the only unifying factor across diverse post-1968 strands. However, the group around Thatcher would harness the chaos, and the movement we now know as Thatcherism would gradually take hold and in many ways become a dominant, but hardly unchallenged, ideological position until the present day, at least in parliamentary politics. See, for instance, the British Social Attitudes surveys, which have shown a sharp increase in the popularity of individualism and hostility to welfare, particularly in younger generations. Now, the Bible played a not insignificant role in Thatcher's thinking. As leader of the Conservatives, she gave 4 major speeches, as well as various comments in interviews, on the centrality of the Bible and Christianity in her politics, and indeed Western politics. This includes, of course, the so-called Sermon on the Mount, amongst many others that she gave in the 70s and 80s. While Thatcher had shifted from a Methodist commitment to becoming an Anglican, presumably to gain acceptance as a Tory, around the mid-1970s she was rediscovering, conveniently it might be added, her nonconformist Methodist roots, particularly with reference to her father, Alfred Roberts, and his heavily Bible-based individualist, self-reliant moralism, with an emphasis on local charitable giving over statist welfare provision. Now, throughout Thatcher's speeches, there are plenty of cliches from the liberal Bible tradition, the cultural Bible traditions, which could have been uttered by any number of politicians over the past 100 years. However, as I said, she did something distinctive at the time. Running throughout Thatcher's speeches on religion, Christianity, and the Bible is the idea and the emphasis on renewing the spirit of the nation for the present. And renewal, of course, meant a more distinctively Thatcherite vision for Britain. And here it is we get something closer to what we might even identify as the neoliberal Bible, and her dismissal of post-war alternatives which she believed were too state-heavy and functioned at the expense of the individual. For Thatcher, quote, men of goodwill must be concerned with the relief of poverty and suffering without reliance on the state, and a renewal of the nation for the here and now is needed. Again, Thatcher looked to the past and the Bible for inspiration, and those few individuals, she said, who see visions and dream dreams. The individuals who revive such values come from, she said, a predominantly Christian culture, and were the prophets of the Old Testament, apostles in the New, and the reformers in both church and state. Again, we can overlook the gendered language of Thatcher's time. Such visionaries no doubt implicitly include Thatcher herself. In a barb aimed at Jim Callaghan during the 1979 general election, she tacitly outlined her leadership credentials in elevated and biblical terms of the prophetic outsider bringing change. This is how she defended herself. The Old Testament prophets did not say, brothers, I want a consensus. They said, this is my faith, this is what I passionately believe. If you believe it too, then come with me. Thatcher versus the forces of chaos run throughout her political speeches. And Heather Nunn, for instance, has shown how Thatcher saw herself as a lay preacher whose political leadership was an extension of her religious values, and that her speeches contain the specific imagery of the Egyptian exile, wilderness, tablets of stone, Babylon, and the battles with Satan. Unusually for successful politicians, Thatcher the visionary, in her own way, as her speeches and rhetoric suggest, was attacking a consensus and leading her own neoconservative revolution in political thinking. And such revolutionary thinking almost inevitably needs the devil, or at least a battle of good versus evil. And this sort of quasi-biblical apocalyptic thinking is, of course, classic Thatcher, as is explicit in her views on Reagan's evil empire, i.e. the Soviet Union, and implicit in her thinking about the enemies within. Thatcher certainly claimed that there is always a temptation, she said, not easily resisted, to identify our opponents with the devil. But that suggestion that politics can be presented as a clear and simple choice between good and evil is also tempting. But she dismissed these ideas as evil. And these evil ideas embitter politics, trivialise religion and morality. However, she clearly constructs even this dismissal of the language of evil in nothing less than the language of evil. She also claimed more fundamentally that there is some evil in everyone and that it cannot be banished by sound policies and institutional reforms. And in basic terms, Thatcher believed, to most ordinary people, heaven and hell, right and wrong, good and bad matter. Now, the function of evil worked on two levels for Thatcher: the personal level of individual duty and the level of the state, particularly the impact the state can have on the individual. So I quote, "It is one thing to say that the relief of poverty and suffering is a duty, and quite another to say that this duty can always be efficiently and humanely performed by the state. Indeed, there are grave moral dangers and serious practical ones in letting people get away with the idea that they can delegate all their responsibilities to public officials and institutions." Thatcher did not believe that socialist theory or socialist theory as we know them were contrary to the New Testament, and she did not claim to believe that you can't be a good and sincere Christian and a dedicated social democrat. However, she always qualified this with phrases such as we know them, and social democrat. Because, for Thatcher, the most extreme manifestation of the intrusion of the state was the Soviet Union or Soviet-inspired communism, the evil empire. Yet Thatcher's thinking on such matters was not simply a practical reaction to the Cold War and her hostility to Soviet communism, but a fundamental philosophical disagreement with Marxism and socialism more generally. For Thatcher, where socialists begin with society and how people can be fitted in, we start, she says, with man. And because we see man as a spiritual being, we utterly reject the Marxist view which gives pride of place to economics. Tyranny was, she argued, inherent in, or at least a consequence of, socialist thinking and its downplaying of the role of the individual. The Gulag only happened because socialism demoralized the whole nation and replaced individual conscience by the party, right and wrong by what was good for the revolution. And these radically different philosophical assumptions were, for Thatcher, rooted in the Bible. It's just one quote among many. Totalitarian Marxists will disagree with me in principle. They make no bones about rejecting all the assumptions from which I begin. I believe that their philosophy is utterly inconsistent with the gospel. She expanded this more generally to religion, and when she outlines terrorist groups around the world, and whenever they may be associated with Sikhism or Christianity or Islam or whatever, they only appear to be religious. They're really Marxists. So and that's an important distinction for Thatcher, because she thought religion, no matter how bad it may presently seem, always had hope for the future, whereas Marxism and communism could never have hope for the future. Very important distinction for Thatcher. Thatcher didn't stop with the placement of communism in a Manichaean framework, and despite her qualifications about social democrats, was prepared to extend her view of darkness to what was happening at home. What I believe is an evil, she said in 1981, is sustained inflation. It's worth contextualizing this argument. It was made in the face of anxieties and criticisms over high unemployment, and high unemployment, according to the Thatcher Circle, was deemed to be an unfortunate byproduct of combating high inflation. Thatcher's response was to insist that her attack on inflation was both a moral and economic issue, which required an alternative vision. For over 30 years, she said, the value of our currency has been eroding. It's an insidious evil because its effects are slow to be seen and relatively painless in the short run. Yet it has a morally debilitating influence on all aspects of our national life. It reduces the value of savings and therefore thrift. It undermines financial agreements. It stimulates hostility between workers and employers over matters of pay. It encourages debt and diminishes prospect of jobs. And that's why I put its demise at the top of my list of economic priorities. It is, in my view, a moral issue, not just an economic one. On becoming leader of the Conservative Party, it was statements similar to these that began to mark a more radical break with the economic past. She could be more emphatic still. The post-war Keynesian recipe of endless growth, she said, through high demand levels, has gone sour. That was in a speech to the Young Conservatives in 1977. While she still saw a role for the state in law, education and protection of those most vulnerable, Thatcher argued that if people believe that the state is the answer to everything, people hand over personal responsibility and charity becomes second best. The milk of human kindness will dry up, she said. But Thatcher argued more dramatically, and we might say biblically, that the time will come, indeed it is close at hand, when the taxpayer is willing to provide for the good of humanity will be seen to be far less than what the individual used to be willing to give from love of his neighbour. With an allusion to Luke 10:25-37 in place, Thatcher could prophetically warn, so do not be tempted to identify virtue with collectivism. I wonder whether the state services would have done for the man as much for the man who fell among the thieves as the Good Samaritan did for him. A long-standing favourite parable for Thatcher, this foreshadowed her more famous exposition of the Good Samaritan when she argued no one would remember the Good Samaritan if he'd only had good intentions. He had money as well. The lack of concern for the rights of individual and downplaying of self-help was in sharp distinction, Thatcher claimed, from the major emphasis of the Bible and the New Testament in particular. Indeed, even more fundamental to the Bible than the concept of the nation was the idea of personal moral responsibility. It's more fundamental than the nation in the Bible. Further emphasizing the point of contrast, she could likewise turn to an individualized notion of salvation. Our religion teaches us that every human being is unique and must play his part in working out his own salvation. Thatcher expressed such ideas that in what we might generally label Pauline language. What mattered fundamentally, she claimed, was man's relationship to God. And in the last resort, this depended on the response of the individual soul to God's grace. The New Testament may be preoccupied with the individual, she said, and his need for forgiveness and for the divine strength which comes from those who sincerely accept it. But she did not think this was alien to the Old Testament, or she called the Old Testament. The Ten Commandments, a passage you might recall aimed at Israelites, were addressed to individuals. In statements, she said, "Honour thy father and thy mother, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness," and so on, that thou, to whom these resounding imperatives are addressed, is you and me. Thatcher was also aware that we can deduce from the Bible teachings of the biblical principles of public as well as private morality. But ultimately, all these principles refer back to the individual and his relationships to others. Again, this is dressed up in what is now classic Thatcherism. We must always be aware of supposing that somehow we can get rid of our own moral duties by handing them over to the community, that somehow we can get rid of our own guilt by talking about national and social guilt. We are called on to repent of our own sins, not each other's sins. Notably, the primary social needs in this Thatcherite take on Christianity and the Bible are not to be found in the state as she understood it, but the family, the neighbourhood, and the nation. You recall that Timothy was warned by St. Paul, she noted, that anyone who neglects to provide for his own house, meaning his own family, has disowned the faith and is worse than an infidel. Thatcher also believed that the solution to the tension between individual and society was to be found in the New Testament. Her take on corporate thinking was again expressed in kind of quasi-Pauline language. There is a great Christian doctrine, she said, that we are all members of one another, expressed in the concept of the church on earth as the body of Christ. From this we learn our interdependence and the great truth that we do not achieve happiness or salvation in isolation from each other, but as members of society. This was one of the great biblical truths, which she claimed, which influenced her political thinking. The other was that we are all responsible moral beings with a choice between good and evil. And of course, her individualism was part of that renewed spirit of the corporate entity of the nation, a combination which she also defended with reference to the Bible regularly. Freedom, she argued, requires self-discipline and great responsibility, which is not only tied in with glory and salvation, but also our national greatness. And she looked to the book of Proverbs to provide support. Righteousness exalteth a nation, she quoted from Proverbs 14, verse 34. Now, there are times when Thatcher's rhetoric on individual choice might appear to be perhaps too strongly influenced by a free market philosophy, particularly for anyone trained in historical criticism of the Bible. This is where you might want to cover your eyes and ears. For instance, the following claims are typical, if not memorable, for the connection made between the free market and, of course, the crucifixion. From the beginning, man has been endowed by God with the fundamental right to choose between good and evil. We were made in God's own image, and therefore expected to use all our own power and thought and judgment in exercising that choice. Our Lord Jesus, the Son of God, when faced with his terrible choice and lonely vigil, chose to lay down his life. And this is in the context of her defending her kind of political principles. And her sort of crucifixion exegesis goes on to hint at earning eschatological salvation. Christianity and the Bible has also taught me that in the final analysis, politics is about personal relations, about establishing the conditions in which men and women can best use their fleeting lives in this world to prepare themselves for the next. Yet mixed in with all these ideas of divine grace, and for all her philo-Judaism, there's another story to be told on Thatcher and Judaism, she did ultimately believe in Christianity over against Judaism because, she claimed, I do not, as a Christian, believe that the Old Testament, the history of law, can be fully understood without the New Testament, the history of mercy. Moreover, Sanders hadn't quite got through to Thatcher at this point. Margaret Thatcher did emphatically claim, in a way long familiar to Tory Christians, and we'll come back to this, that there is one heresy which it seems to me that some political doctrines embrace, the belief that man is perfectible. This discussion was in the context of criticisms of socialism and the idea that if education, health and social welfare were correctly administered, then we ideally perhaps would have exorcised the devil. But she claimed this was bad theology. And in her then recent past, she said it was a failure. We have expanded vast efforts and huge sums of money on policies designed to make people better and happier. Have we really brought about a fundamental improvement in man's moral condition? The devil is still with us, recording his successes in the crime figures and all other maladies of society, in spite of its relative material comfort, she argued, as crime figures were rising. But if Thatcher thought human perfection was heretical, then the same logic had to apply equally to herself and free market thinking. You must never be like the parable of the Pharisee, as it were, she claimed while recalling her Christian upbringing in 1985, because you just really know how far you fall short of your ideal, Luke 18, 9-14. Thatcher could therefore claim elsewhere that as a Christian who believes in the Bible, she was bound to shun utopias on this earth and to recognise that there is no change in man's social arrangements which will make him perfectly good and perfectly happy. So the free market enterprise system itself does not automatically have these effects. Of course, Thatcher believed in the necessity of the free market, but it remained one aspect, a very important aspect, in national recovery and prosperity, rather than leading to utopia. Indeed, the lack of utopia meant that she could likewise emphasise the need for charity and claim that the moral dimension of her vision for the recovery of the nation can only come from the teachings of a faith. Then she says, remember the woman with the alabaster jar of ointment. Thatcher's individualist vision was also designed to generate wealth, well-being and freedom, her words, while the state, as well as charitable individuals and organisations, could provide a safety net for the more defenceless members of society. Thatcher believed that collectively the 10 Commandments, loving our neighbour as ourselves and the importance of observing a strict code of law, the New Testament record of the incarnation, the teachings of Christ, and the establishment of the kingdom of God all provide a proper attitude to work and principles to shape economic and social life. And then, of course, she infamously used the example of Paul in 2 Thessalonians 3, verse 10. If a man will not work, he shall not eat. And this was justification of the view that we must work and use our talents to create wealth. Indeed, abundance rather than poverty has legitimacy which derives from the very nature of creation. This meant that the creation of wealth was for Thatcher a Christian obligation and a fulfilment of our role as stewards of the resources and talents the Creator has provided for us. Here, Thatcher turned to the seemingly lost idea that is inherent, she said, in Christ's parable of the talents. Thatcherite exegesis would have it that the steward, who simply did not use the resources entrusted to him, was roundly condemned, while the two who used them to produce more wealth were congratulated even more. She qualified this by immediately adding that to endorse the mediocre, to flinch from the challenge, or complain that the government ought to be doing something is not the way to rekindle the spirit. But if the Bible was to be part of wealth creation, it runs into one obvious difficulty, those biblical passages which appear to suggest an outright hostility to wealth. I have the needle, rich man and Lazarus, God and mammon, and so on. Harking back to her father's exegetical views, Thatcher dealt with such difficulties by interpreting them in a relative sense. Christ did not condemn riches as such, she argued, only the way in which they were used and those who put their trust in them. What the church needs to do, she later added, is to guide us about the use of this world's wealth. Again, Thatcher did argue that charity and social responsibility are ways in which wealth can be used in favour of good. But Thatcher was still aware of what might be seen as the selfish excesses of a neoliberal way of thinking by putting too much trust in money. The 10th commandment recognises that making money and owning things could become selfish activities, she said. And with her own brand of nonconformism coming through, she even claimed that those who adopt a philosophy of eat, drink and be merry for tomorrow we die can result in a grasping for wealth for its own sake and pursuit of the selfish pleasure. Note that there is a degree of tension here. We get the less definitive can result, not does result, which contrasts sharply with the denunciations of collectivism, which were very absolute. We also get the negative implications of this selfish attitude labelled as a philosophy, with the implicit suggestion that it's not really quite biblical or Christian. Philosophies tend to be other things. Indeed, the Bible is referenced to show that those who live for the moment are very much in the wrong, Thatcher thinks. Yet this would simultaneously come into some tension with Ecclesiastes 8:15, which she also cites, but doesn't, no, she references, but not cites. So I commend enjoyment, for there is nothing better for people under the sun to eat, drink, and enjoy themselves, for this will go with them in their toil through the days of life that God gives them under the sun. It is as if the implicit exegetical tension were unconsciously reflecting the political tension of her individualism. Now, I argue in much more detail in the book that quasi-Thatcherite themes of individualism became increasingly embedded in cultural understandings of the Bible in the 1970s and 80s. Most tellingly, among those who may have been hostile to Thatcherism were, unintentionally most of the time, I think, contributing towards or providing an indication of Thatcherism taking hold more broadly. Likewise, but more explicitly, the absorption of Thatcher's Bible would happen in the Labour movement. Of course, Thatcher's Bible was not the only post-1968 option. The Radical Bible, including the accompanying rhetoric of freedom, was given a new lease of life in the hands of figures such as Christopher Hill and Tony Benn. However, in parliamentary terms, they lost, and the influence of the Radical Bible has all been but removed from Parliament. A significant moment came in 1993 in a Christian Socialist movement publication edited by Christopher Bryant, later a new Labour MP, called Reclaiming the Ground, Christianity and Socialism. In addition to a foreword by Tony Blair, the book foregrounded the role of the then Labour leader John Smith, who, like other participants, felt the need to incorporate the Thatcherite challenge, albeit grudgingly, into their understanding of the Bible, whilst elsewhere, Sheffield to be precise, Tony Benn was justifying Clause 4, the commitment to common or public ownership, with reference to Acts of the Apostles. But Benn was effectively the last significant advocate of the Radical Bible in Parliament, which presently seems as obsolete in the Labour Party as Clause 4. And it was, of course, Tony Blair and New Labour who had developed Thatcherism most vigorously in the Labour Party, and in this instance, Thatcherite exegesis. Contrary to popular receptions of Alistair Campbell's ominous warning that we don't do God, there is a fair bit of Bible in Blair's speeches. This is quite interesting because Campbell tried to cross them out as much as possible, but he was a long committed atheist. He didn't recognise the Bible half the time, so they kept creeping through. Blair would run with Thatcher's Cold War thinking, but this time under the influence of liberal interventionism and in the direction of the War on Terror, would transform the historic Labour rhetoric of a New Jerusalem and apocalyptic, in inverted commas, utopianism into arguments about bringing individualism, freedom, rights, democracy, markets to so-called rogue states. Minus the confrontational element of Thatcher's biblical rhetoric and with some nods to Labour's past, Blair would find much the same kind of views on individualism and a limited role of the state. But this time, and this is a crucial addition, this time he would add his own influential strand of understanding the Bible, social liberalism. And by this I simply mean issues such as civil partnerships and gay marriage could now find support in the Bible, if it were read or applied properly. And this socially liberal qualification, but minus the radical edge, has likewise become a norm, but certainly in public pronouncements of Scripture among Labour politicians. For instance, Last year, in the same-sex marriage debates, Labour politicians David Lammy and Toby Perkins used the rhetoric of Jesus the outcast. But unlike a whole host of Labour politicians before them, there's no element of overturning or confronting power from the radical Bible tradition. Instead, Jesus was a liberal ahead of his time and tolerant towards all sorts of people, and would certainly have supported same-sex marriage if asked. Sadly, he wasn't. Now, the liberal Bible, as modified by Blair, is the Bible, so the Thatcher Bible, as modified by Blair, is the Bible inherited by the coalition, as can be seen in examples from Cameron, Gove, and the 2013 publication by the Lib Dems, called The Liberal Democrats Do God. Now, this brought together a number of prominent Liberal Democrat politicians. It's very hard to read that. This was a potentially important moment for the Liberal Democrats because despite their nonconformist history, and Gladstone himself, they have gained a reputation as a secular party with an openly atheist leader in Nick Clegg and recently having one of Parliament's most active atheists in Eben Harris. However, despite being mercilessly hammered in the press for allegedly making grand claims that God is a Liberal Democrat, and despite claims from Liberal Democrat supporters that this was a new development, Liberal Democrats Do God is in fact largely standard stuff for English politics. I'll give one example, but there are loads in the book, of the victory of Thatcher's Bible. I mean, throughout the book it's just endless stuff about how the Bible's tolerant, it's about freedom, it's about democracy, all the kind of cliches you find in political speeches. But one essay in particular received media mockery, and it's the introduction by Steve Webb, the Minister of State for Pensions. And it's claimed that God is a liberal. He said liberal lowercase. The press kept saying, oh, he meant liberal Democrat. But he did use lowercase liberal. I mean, equally as implausible. Webb, whether he likes it or not, is close to how Thatcher understood the Bible. As we saw with Thatcher, and we see with Blair, fundamental to the Bible were ideas of personal, moral responsibility, freedom and individualism. But Webb, quite remarkably, even saw the crucifixion and the idea that Jesus chose to die as an important part of the liberal teaching in the Bible. Pretty much the same argument as Thatcher made about the crucifixion. And Thatcher's Bible is elsewhere present in Webb's essay. If the almighty creator of the universe does not impose his will on creation, then we flawed individuals who are involved in the political process should be deeply cautious about using the power of the state to impose our will on others. Clearly, there have to be frameworks and boundaries, and the state is right to impose those. But beyond this, our faith surely teaches us that we should be very wary of anything more coercive. Those who recognize in the gospel a deep reverence for human freedom and self-determination will find a natural home in the Liberal Democrats. Incidentally, as an aside, you've noticed throughout a lot of this, not Thatcher, but a number of the other politicians, they always just say the gospel, the Bible. It's not, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 6. Now, these ideas also echo Thatcher's interpretation of the Bible, framed in terms of her opposition to socialism, Marxism, Soviet Union, and so on. Unlike some of the figures from the radical Bible tradition, like Tony Benn, but in common with a strong Tory tradition, original sin was important, as indeed it is throughout the Liberal Democrats Do God. For Thatcher, original sin and human imperfection were important, if only because of her dislike for the assumed opposite, the idea that human beings were able to achieve perfection. And it's significant that for Thatcher, this sort of discussion was generated in the context of criticism of socialism and state interventionism, which she argued could not improve the moral condition of the human being. This was not just part of Thatcher's attack on the role of the state, of course, but a perception of utopian thinking, which she argued marked socialism, and which she thought inevitably led to the suppression of the individual and ultimately the Gulag. For Thatcher, for the Lib Dems, the Bible or the gospel and its apparent concerns for freedom and individualism are part of the antidote to state-heavy thinking, even if, like Webb and other Liberal Democrats in the book, she still saw a role for the state, albeit limited. Another important example from the age of coalition concerns the 400th anniversary of the King James Bible. Now, as some of you may remember, throughout the celebrations, it was extremely difficult to escape the praise heaped on the King James Version as part of our treasured English heritage, or our treasured British heritage, usually English, by the way, despite, of course, having a Scottish king. Speaking at the end of the 400th anniversary of the KJV, David Cameron claimed that Britain can still be understood as a biblical and Christian nation. What Cameron did not mean was equally important. He did not mean that Britain is or should become a theocracy, nor that British people should all be going to church, singing hymns, praying to God, fasting, dealing with heretics appropriately, vigorously converting non-believers, and so on. It would be a great surprise if Cameron did advocate such things, given that he described his religious faith as a typical member of the Church of England. And I quote, "It is a bit like the reception of Magic FM in the Chilterns. It sort of comes and goes." Instead, Cameron's vision of a Christian nation with the King James Bible at its heart is, as with Blair and Thatcher, a thoroughly liberalised notion of what a multicultural and multi-faith Christian country ought to be, with anything unpalatable to this idea of the nation state removed. So Cameron's King James Version is about, quote, human rights, equality, monarchy, parliamentary democracy, freedom, language, culture, abolition of slavery, emancipation of women, responsibility, hard work, charity, compassion, humility, self-sacrifice, love, pride, working for the common good, and honouring the social obligations we have to one another, our families, our communities. These are the values we treasure. All in the King James Bible. Again, it would presumably be pointless asking what Cameron would have made about the details of Abishag the Shunammite, Joshua's conquest, posting parts of a chopped-up concubine, smashing babies' heads against rocks, labelling Gentiles dogs, condemning rich to Hades, destroying idols, the weeping and gnashing of teeth, speaking in tongues, or perhaps more pertinent still, using the King James Bible to convert heathens. Instead, the King James Bible and Christian values have to be understood in terms of liberal parliamentary democracy with a soft Thatcherite spin. Such fragmented memories, simultaneously nostalgic while forgetting other seemingly important, uncomfortable, and even dangerous issues, provide a ready-made cultural icon in the King James Bible, with its antiquated language, gold lettering, leather-bound cover, not to mention numerous cultured supporters of its historic and aesthetic qualities. Here we can see a more implicit Thatcherite victory, and one I suspect she would not have approved, at least not in the sense that I interpret her victory. In May 2012, Michael Gove, Education Secretary, and with the backing of private donors, took advantage of this cultural icon when he sent out copies of the King James Bible to English state schools, with the following printed in gold on the spine, presented by the Secretary of State for Education. Following typical endorsements of the King James Bible in the 400th anniversary and beyond, Gove explained that he wanted this sent to schools because the King James Bible has a profound impact on our culture, as ever. Every school pupil should have the opportunity to learn about this book and the impact it has had on our history, language, literature, and democracy. It's worth noting, as an aside here, that Gove's Bible neatly complements one of the more controversial aspects of Gove's time at education, namely his draft proposals for the history curriculum, which placed a strong emphasis on a patriotic, narrative history of Britain and the importance of history for national, effectively English, identity. And yet, don't plenty of schools already have a King James Bible? Does anyone really think anyone will actually read the King James Bible at school? Would it be overly cynical to suggest that donating King James Bibles to school is an exercise in PR? Or further exercise in promoting Govian history? In fact, comments of sceptical inner-city teachers who will not be using the Bible, or those who see through the apparent PR purposes of the exercise, are, predictably perhaps, found in the same newspaper reports as Gove's plan. It would probably not be a great surprise if Cameron, or even Gove, didn't really believe that the King James Bible would be taken up and read even by a handful of children in a given school. Yet all the while, the official narrative, and that's what's important, of a grand, democratic, cultured English civilization associated with the King James Bible continues comparatively unchallenged despite the popular cynicism over readership. Presumably this is the real ideological function of the story. But there is something else to the assumptions about the King James Bible, that it must obviously be a part of British or English cultural heritage. Against the odds, the King James Bible has continued to survive, even in radically different ways from its pre-20th century dominance. Being arguably the cultural Bible helps, and there are a number of general ideological reasons for its survival in Britain in an era of post-modernity, commercialisation and neoliberalism. The postmodern era has seen an explosion in different types of Bible, with an accompanying fetish for the repackaging of already existing biblical translations for a target audience or market, neatly replicating the relentless postmodern interest in multiple identities and a relentless quest for more markets. As Katie Edwards has shown, the Bible in advertising only needs a split second to convey a range of common sense meanings, involving the intersection of, among other things, branding, gender, and nationalism. As an embedded cultural icon, the King James Bible was ready to survive the numerous different Bibles on the market, and in one sense it can take its place among or alongside the Queen James Bible, the Soldier's Bible, or indeed any number of Zondervan specialised Bibles whose true meaning of the Bible should be recognisable on sight to anyone in the know. The true image is the Bible for girls. There's an engaged couple's Bible. There's a married couple's Bible, which you can buy after you've been engaged, presumably, even though it's still the NIV. There's the stock car racing Bible. That's for boys, obviously. And if you're in a certain given context, you know what this... You don't need to read the Bible. You know what it already means. Now, the distinctively branded King James Bible has managed to stand out and is instantly recognisable. Leather-bound text, 2 columns, gold-coloured typesetting of Holy Bible, possibly the Bible, that must be bought for christenings. Whether we know precisely that it was published in 1611 is another issue. Its branding and image retains a certain ancient and nostalgic mystique, while explicitly or implicitly remaining the authoritative Bible for English or British nationalism. And this can be seen in discussions of its language and idioms. David Crystal's got a really nice book on this, and how the King James Bible has survived and been modified in an age of consumer capitalism, fully unleashed in the Thatcher era. To summarise then, Thatcher's Bible with its Blairite qualification is thus the assumed Bible of today's English politics. This modified version of the Liberal Bible, perhaps we might call it the neoliberal Bible, has suppressed any of those radical tendencies it once harnessed and has taken control of party political hermeneutics. And it's here to stay, for now. But before I finish, I want to give a kind of postscript. That people make the Bible mean whatever they want it to mean will probably not come as a great surprise. So another question might be this. Why would an English politician bother using the Bible at all? There is no European-style Christian Democratic Party of any note. They're not going to swing an election, even if there is some evidence, small evidence, the parties know not to ignore denominational and religious votes. Indeed, we might recall Alistair Campbell's fears that the electorate may even hate or distrust politicians using the Bible. Furthermore, politicians who quite clearly do not claim that God or the Bible agrees with their given political party are likely to be the subject of ridicule for claiming God does support their party. See the pious Lib Dems and Tony Blair, who real concerns that they were being ridiculed for their beliefs. Why risk press humiliation in navigating too far from a safe Bible towards the feral Bible? Similarly, it's also clear that there is no danger to a politician expressing doubts about faith before returning to the Bible for support. Cameron, for instance. Yet Cameron still turns to the Bible to defend principles deemed culturally important. So again, why? One obvious reason, which partly explains uses by Blair and Thatcher, is that a given politician may be a dedicated Christian for whom the Bible has had a central role in their life. But this doesn't explain plenty of other political figures, including Cameron. Another reason might be inherited language. Knowledge of a specific biblical passage may indeed not be what it was in the 17th century, but the Bible is deeply embedded in the history of parliamentary politics and British and European history more generally. It's no surprise that vestiges of this language remain today, even if the 1960s represents a dramatic change in the influence of the church, a sharp decline in church attendance, and the decline of a quasi-Protestant biblical literacy. Indeed, the two dominant political parties of the past 40 years have historic traditions of Bible use and significant Christian influences, whether Tory Anglicanism or Labour nonconformism, in addition to Liberal nonconformism. Again, no surprise that vestiges of such party traditions remain. There are more local reasons still. The Bible may be used to gain, or at least not lose, the support of different constituencies, as Thatcher did in attracting strands of morally conservative Christians and Jews in the 1970s. There might not be significant enough voting constituency which appreciates biblical references, but there is presumably no harm in trying to keep them, or indeed keeping Christian lobbyists happy, with vague references and allusions that will not alienate those less impressed. The use of the Bible might also function as a means to keep the peace with church groups or bishops in the House of Lords, or indeed as a sop to disgruntled elements of a given party, or to get a positive mention in the right-wing press. It's quite common, actually. But the Bible may also represent, I think, some kind of implicit or even explicit authority for a politician or a political position, which partly explains why the cultural Bible appears right across the political spectrum. Jacques Boulinablau wrote about the most profound insight I've ever absorbed about my subject matter was a lesson learned from a highly respected and unnamed, annoyingly, European professor. Don't you understand? The Bible in and of itself is neither good nor evil. It can be used for both. It says everything, it says nothing. The Bible is just raw power. And this raw power is more or less the equivalent to Dean Galbraith's comments on popular uses of the Bible in American churches. This concept of God's word, he says, becomes a placeholder in the community's authoritative discourse, including, but not limited to, the actual content of the Bible. We can even see reference to this authoritative power in interpreters of political uses of the Bible in English tradition and representing some very different political perspectives. From a Marxist perspective, Roland Baugh saw the revolutionary power of the Bible in England and in his analysis of E.P. Thompson and framed it in terms of myth. These myths were powerful in guiding political discourse and so on. Connecting ideas such as tolerance with political readings of the Bible, Nick Spencer similarly argued that all politics rests on this wider myth. But Spencer's Bible-based myth is tied in with a preference for liberal parliamentary democracy, representing both freedom and order. And despite their differing commitments, Baugh and Spencer both share the assumption of the Bible as a powerful political force. But what actual grounding do these myths have? We may be seeing here, particularly with the appeal to myth and power, the idea of an unseen authority which underpins, justifies, has guided, and might continue to guide political systems. In many ways, this is a real aside, it has similarities with the idea of spiritual readings of the Bible, the appeal to something beyond the literal meaning, even an implicit appeal to something transcendent, which is unlikely ever to be mentioned explicitly in mainstream parliamentary English politics. At this point, we are starting to get into broader questions concerning reception of the Bible and assumptions of a guiding third party alongside the reader and text, which, I'm afraid, are beyond a paper such as this. Thank you.